Sometimes it feels like we're drowning in information, doesn't it? Especially when you're trying to figure out the best way forward with, well, big things like mission or community building.
Hmm.
We end up creating all these structures, programs, layers of systems, and you kind of step back and wonder, did it always have to be this complicated? Is there maybe a simpler way?
It's a really timely question. I mean, so many modern approaches just seem to default to complexity, and maybe we lose sight of the basic principles sometimes.
Yeah.
And funny enough, sometimes the best insights aren't brand new. They're found by looking way back to the very beginning, actually.
That's exactly where we're headed in this deep dive.
Yep.
We've been digging into sources looking at a really old pattern for mission and church life, something the material calls an integrated district model.
Right, and the inspiration is straight out of the New Testament. We're really focusing on the Apostle Paul's journey, specifically that first one, through Cyprus, southern Galatia, Pamphylia, pulling insights from Acts, from his letters.
And the mission for us here is to really try and pull out the core principles from how they did things back then.
Yeah.
To see, what might that suggest for rethinking, maybe even simplifying, how we approach church and mission today. Because, well, sources we looked at are pretty clear. Things have changed a lot in 2,000 years.
Yeah.
They've gotten a bit too complex.
Yeah, and get ready, because some of these ideas might feel, well, pretty countercultural compared to how a lot of churches and mission groups work now.
Okay, let's get into that. The starting point in our source material. It doesn't really pull any punches about how different things look now.
No, it makes a pretty strong case that, the church today has evolved so much, maybe Paul or even Jesus wouldn't fully recognize parts of it. The argument is that we've built up all these systems, ministries, programs, offices, institutions, policies, and they're so demanding. They eat up the time, the energy, the resources.
The very things you need to actually connect with people.
Exactly. To actually engage communities, make disciples, plant new churches, the machinery itself can become a roadblock.
Wow. But the source is careful, though, right? It's not saying there's only one way.
Oh, absolutely not. It really stresses that God uses diversity. Different kinds of people, different kinds of churches, reaching all sorts of different communities and cultures. The point isn't some rigid, controlling formula.
Right, yeah.
It's about finding those underlying principles that work across different contexts. Trying to just clone churches, well, that's probably not going to reach the unique people in any given place effectively.
That's a really important distinction. Principles, not just methods copied blindly. So, okay, when the source digs into that New Testament pattern, what are the absolute, rock bottom essential elements it points to?
When you boil it all down, the source says it really came down to two main things: planting teams and local churches.
Okay, sounds simple enough, but they weren't just operated in a vacuum, were they?
No, not at all. The source points out they were definitely connected. They related back to a central point, which it compares to the Jerusalem headquarters and also to a regional base, like the Antioch hub.
Right. Let's unpack that Jerusalem connection first. The source seems careful about defining its role. It wasn't like a modern HQ dictating everything.
No, not according to the source. It's pretty clear Paul wasn't, getting his marching orders from a board in Jerusalem or just working for them on the mission field.
Okay, so if it wasn't control, what was the relationship then? What did Jerusalem offer?
Well, the source really highlights Paul's respect for the leaders there. He valued that connection for mutual cooperation, partnership, definitely for moral and spiritual wisdom, and maybe uniquely for that direct link, the testimony, the experience of those who had actually been with Jesus.
Ah, okay. So connection to the living history, the eyewitnesses.
Yeah.
That's different.
It really is. And the source gives examples, right? Barnabas bringing Paul to the apostles early on. The leaders in Jerusalem helping Paul escape when he was in danger. The Antioch church sending famine relief to the elders in Jerusalem specifically.
Right.
And even when they disagreed, like Paul challenging some leaders about Gentile freedoms, he didn't just cut ties. He stayed connected. Bringing those offerings back from the Gentile churches was a huge statement about unity, one body.
So it's a relationship built on respect, shared history, unity, even when there's tension.
Exactly. The source kind of frames their role more as advisory oversight, maybe movement catalysts is a good way to put it. They had this specific responsibility for Jewish people, but they affirmed the Gentile mission. Paul sought their counsel, not really for permission, but because agreeing on the core gospel message was vital for the whole movement's unity.
But there's a warning in there too, isn't there, about this kind of central connection going too far?
Yeah, that's the risk, overreach. When a headquarters starts acting like it needs to be the final judge on everything, demanding approval for every little initiative, well, that shifts from leadership to micromanagement.
And that stifles things.
Right. The source argues it just erects barriers instead of releasing teams for mission.
Got it. So Jerusalem, wisdom, history, unity, but not day-to-day control. Now, what about Antioch, the hub? The source really plays up its importance for Paul's work, especially early on.
Oh, absolutely key. For that first big journey, Antioch was home base, not Jerusalem. And later, you see him setting up similar kinds of hubs in places like Ephesus, Corinth.
So what was special about Antioch? What made it such a vital hub, according to the source? Acts gives us some clues there.
Yeah, the source paints a picture of Antioch as just this incredibly vibrant, multicultural church, a place where disciples were multiplying like crazy. And the leaders there, they weren't just, administrators. They were spirit-filled, proven, hands-on evangelists, disciple makers, church planters, movement leaders, and they were actively equipping the believers in Antioch.
That feels really significant compared to maybe some modern setups where the leaders manage others doing the work rather than being deep in it themselves.
Exactly. And the source points out how they made decisions. It was guided by the Spirit through worship, fasting, prayer. When they sent out Paul and Barnabas, it explicitly says they were sent on their way by the Holy Spirit.
And how did Antioch support them once they were out there?
It was like a home base should be, right? Supportive, encouraging, welcoming. The source quotes Acts 14, saying they were committed to the grace of God. Antioch sent them off with trust and blessing and then welcomed them back with open arms, eager to hear everything God had done.
Okay, and here's where it gets really, really interesting and maybe challenging for us today. What did Antioch not do for these mission teams?
Yeah, this is a big one. The source makes a real point of highlighting there's zero indication Antioch dictated who had to be on the team.
Okay.
Or exactly where they had to go. Or, and this is the picker, that Antioch provided the actual funding for the mission itself.
Whoa, hang on. No funding for the mission trips from the sending church. That just turns most modern mission funding completely upside down.
It does.
So where did the money come from? These were not cheap trips.
This is where the source gets really specific and, yeah, pretty countercultural. It says, Paul carried no funds designated for planting new churches, and he didn't take any money from those new churches either.
Okay, so boat tickets, food, lodging. How'd they pay for that?
The strategy, the source argues, was that the team worked while they traveled.
They worked. Like actual jobs alongside the mission work. Tent making and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And the source points out this wasn't seen as a negative. It actually connected them with people in the marketplaces, creating natural ways to build relationships and share their faith. And any funding needed for, multiplying disciples and planting churches in the new areas, that came from the harvest itself, from the local communities, the new believers within those districts.
So the resources for the work in a new place came from the results of the work in that place.
That's the idea. And another crucial point the source makes. The team members weren't paid a salary for making disciples. And the new disciples weren't paid or compensated for becoming Christians or participating. Paul seems to have actively avoided both scenarios.
Why does the source hammer this funding point so hard? What's the big deal?
Well, it argues that relying on outside money can actually be a distraction for planters. It can disconnect them from the very community they're trying to reach. It could potentially skew the motives of new believers, and ultimately, it might even weaken the whole initiative, making it dependent rather than self-sustaining.
And the really punchy, maybe slightly uncomfortable statement the source makes
is that money is just not needed to follow Jesus's methods for making disciples or building movements. You don't need money to talk to your neighbors, your colleagues at work, your family, your friends about your faith.
Wow, that cuts right through a lot of assumptions, doesn't it?
Yeah.
That you need big budgets before you could even start doing meaningful mission or planting.
Yeah.
Really shifts the focus back to relationships and just the power of the gospel itself.
It really forces you to reevaluate what's truly essential, yeah.
Okay, let's shift then to what the source calls the absolute must-haves, the planning teams and the local churches. It keeps stressing that the headquarters and hubs exist to serve these guys, right?
Exactly. The whole support system exists for the front lines, not the other way around. That's key.
So tell us more about these planting teams based on the source. What were they like?
Well, the first one out of Antioch was small. Paul and Barnabas were the experienced leaders, and John Mark joined them initially.
Right.
They were specifically, affirmed and set apart by the church in Antioch and by the Spirit for a specific task. Go into these Gentile regions, share the gospel, start new churches.
How did they decide where to go? Was it random?
The source suggests it often followed natural connections and made sense with Jesus' overall commission. Heading to Cyprus first, for example, that was Barnabas and John Mark's home turf. A logical starting point.
Makes sense. And they didn't just vanish, right? They came back and reported.
Oh yeah, Acts 14 spells it out. They returned to Antioch, gathered the church, and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles, accountability, and sharing the news.
Okay. And the local churches themselves, how did they actually form?
The source really emphasizes these were gatherings of new disciples. It wasn't primarily about Christians moving from one church to another.
Gotcha.
The main focus was making disciples. As people came to faith in Christ, they naturally started gathering together and boom, new church.
And on that return leg of the first journey, the source highlights a really critical action they took within these fledgling churches.
Yes, absolutely crucial. They went back through Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, and Pisidia, strengthening and encouraging the believers. And then the source points to Acts 14. They appointed elders for them in each church.
In each church?
In each church. And then they entrusted them with prayer and fasting to the Lord in whom they had put their trust.
Appointing local leaders, elders, that quickly? That seems like a massive handover of responsibility, doesn't it?
It really is. And the source sees this urgency, finding qualified local people, appointing elders, handing over responsibility as absolutely vital. It fostered spiritual maturity. It made the churches sustainable.
And it freed up the team.
Exactly.
Yep.
It allowed the planting team to move on, to pioneer new areas. Their job in that place was done, essentially.
So they didn't stick around to become the long-term pastors of the churches they planted.
No. The source says their work in that phase was completed. They'd helped plant these sustainable, whole local churches that could now take full responsibility for mission in their own regions. Then the team could head back to their hub, Antioch.
Man, that model, empowering local leaders so quickly and moving on, that feels dramatically different from a lot of long-term missionary work or even church planting strategies we see today.
It really does. It places incredible trust in those local believers and in the Holy Spirit working among them.
Okay, let's talk about something that often defines modern church life: buildings and programs. Our source specifically takes aim at the idea that these define the mission, especially when it introduces this concept of district mission.
Yeah, it uses some vivid examples, like judging your church's success by how packed your small building is. Well, that completely ignores the thousands of people living right outside the door who don't know Jesus.
Or the youth pastor example.
Right. Focusing all your energy on the 5 kids who show up to the youth program, while missing the thousands of other young people in the wider district, it challenges that inward focus.
So how does the source suggest we should define our mission field, our district, if not by buildings or programs?
Simply by geography. A specific city, a suburban area, a rural region. It shares this great story about a Pastor Bill Otto in a country district.
Okay.
His district, in his mind, wasn't just the 2 small church buildings he looked after. It was the hundreds of square miles around them, and everyone living there, church members, people in town, farmers out on their properties.
Wow. So he didn't just see himself as the pastor of those 2 little congregations, but somehow responsible for the spiritual well-being of the entire geographic area.
That's exactly it. He and the believers felt it was their shared job to bring the gospel to everyone in that region because, as he put it, no one else is going to do it. Simple as that.
So how did they even begin to tackle that, an entire geographic district?
The method was relational. Visiting homes, meeting people right where they were, really listening to their lives, their stories, and then, naturally, introducing Jesus.
And this wasn't just Pastor Bill running around.
No. The source stresses it was a team effort, and the team wasn't just a committee. He said all the believers were friends and were our team. Everyone was involved.
So the team was basically every Christian living in that area, taking ownership together for their local mission field.
That's the picture. And even the way they related to their headquarters reflected this. It wasn't about filling out forms. It was simple, based on trust. Leaders from the central office would come and visit regularly, stay in people's homes, join in the local life, be vulnerable, be open, relational accountability.
This theme of trusting local believers, local leaders,
Yeah.
it seems absolutely fundamental to this whole integrated district idea.
Trust is the glue. It's essential. And it has to flow in all directions, along with everyone being clear on their roles and responsibilities.
How did that trust play out in the examples the source gave?
Well, the district pastor has to genuinely work with and rely on the leaders the local members choose, recognizing their gift. There's that great anecdote about the local leader who told the pastor straight up, "I don't trust any pastor."
Okay.
But this guy was super reliable at getting things done when you gave him a job and trusted him. And the pastor's reaction wasn't defensiveness. It was basically, "Okay, I think I can work with that." He showed trust by empowering the guy in his area of strength.
And the trust needs to flow down from the top, too. From headquarters.
Absolutely crucial. That trust has to be real, not just lip service. From headquarters towards the district pastor, towards the local churches, towards those local leaders, the attitude needs to be, "We trust you. Give it a shot. We're behind you." More like encouragers and supporters, not, gatekeepers demanding permission slips.
And the pastor's role in this model,
Mm-hmm.
the source uses the word apostolic. What does that mean in this context?
Yeah, not necessarily like an official title, but more about the function. Apostolic in the sense of being a pioneer, like Paul, focused on sending people out, catalyzing new things, fostering growth across the district, rather than primarily just being the long-term, settled shepherd focusing only on one or two established congregations. More outward-focused, maybe?
And this whole approach allows for, even expects, diversity. It resists that cookie-cutter tendency.
Oh, completely vital. The source hammers this. No church should be a clone. Because every group of believers is different. Their relational networks, that ethne idea, again, are different. Their specific communities are different.
Right.
So the district churches, their leaders, all the members, they take full responsibility for reaching their specific region. And the source notes, they don't divvy up their time or effort based on which little church gives the most money. The responsibility is for the whole district, period.
Okay, so let's connect the dots. How does this ancient model, these principles from Paul's journeys, loop back to the basic method Jesus himself used?
Yeah, the source draws a direct line. It argues the apostles' success stemmed directly from following Jesus' own reproducible and maybe kind of counterintuitive way of doing things.
And it highlights that Jesus' method wasn't about, manipulation or force or status or big institutions or fancy building. None of that.
So what was it about?
It was deeply incarnational, relational.
Yeah.
It was about mingling with people, entering their world, and following their ethne. That Greek word again, ethne. Often translated nations, but the source gives it a broader sense here.
Yeah, really stressing the relational networks. The Great Commission in Matthew 28, go and make disciples of all ethne. The source reads that not just as geography, but as summing up this whole relational way of operating. Make disciples through those natural connections.
Can you give some examples from Jesus' ministry?
Sure. Think about Andrew immediately telling his brother Peter, Philip going straight to his friend Nathaniel, sharing Jesus within their closest relationships first.
Okay.
Or think about Jesus leaving the Samaritan woman at the well, or the man freed from demons in the Decapolis. He knew they'd become instant witnesses, spreading the news organically through their existing social networks in their communities. He trusted the message to spread relationally. And his invitations. They weren't just to believe something, they were invitations to do something, to participate, right?
Exactly. They were experiential, relational, participatory, often challenging, yeah, even sacrificial, but also incredibly empowering. He wasn't just calling a few special people. The source argues he was equipping everyone who believed to immediately start participating and making more disciples within their own relational streams.
So this idea that every single new believer is instantly part of the mission team, equipped and expected to share within their world, that was foundational. That's the argument. Absolutely central to the apostles' vision for movements. Disciple-making wasn't some specialized job for the professionals. It was the natural, expected activity of every single follower of Jesus, right where they were.
Okay, so let's bring this home. For you listening right now, what is all this deep dive into an ancient model? What might it suggest for us today?
Well, when you really look at this New Testament pattern, a few things jump out, don't they? This profound focus on empowering local believers, grounding mission in actual geographic communities, not just programs, placing real trust in local leaders who rise up from within, receiving encouragement and support, but not control, and crucially, not external funding for the mission itself from those central connection points, funding the local work from the harvest in that community.
Yeah.
And seeing multiplication happen primarily through natural relationships, not relying only on complex programs or big institutional structures.
So as you think about your own situation, your own community, what resonates with you from this model? What might it make you reconsider about how you see mission, or even just the purpose of your church in your local patch?
It definitely offers a different lens to look through, doesn't it?
It certainly does.
Yeah.
Looking back at this original pattern, it really can give fresh eyes for the complexities we face now. And like you said, this deep dive wasn't about handing out a rigid blueprint.
No.
It was about digging for those underlying principles. Trust the local context, embrace diversity, empower every single believer.
Yeah, the potential power in just getting back to those simple foundational things. It's pretty striking when you think about it.
So maybe a final thought, something provocative for you to mull over after this deep dive. If money isn't actually the essential ingredient for you to share your faith with your neighbors, your work colleagues, your friends, and if the original idea really was that every believer is already on the team for reaching their community, what could actually happen? What might be possible if you and the people you know decided to take full responsibility for sharing good news right there in your local district, defined by the streets around you and the people you know, not just by church programs or buildings?